Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, and I have the honor of serving as your chair for the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. And I'm so honored today as we continue our celebration and commemoration of Black History Month to welcome to our weekly chair chat, Professor Tanya K. Hernández. Professor Hernández is the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University, and she's also the author of her new book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. Professor Hernández, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so honored that you are here. I am fascinated by your book. I appreciate your contribution and your scholarship in this space. And I just want to really start with lifting up one of the central claims of your book, which is that Latinos can be racist, and in particular, harbor anti-Black biases that engage in resulting in discrimination against Afro-Latinos and African-Americans. However, as you point out in your book, a widely espoused notion is that Latinos are racially innocent. What do you mean by racially innocent?
I use that as a way to encapsulate all the ways in which Latinos, because of our racial pathologies from Latin America and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, that we view racism as a problem that pertains to white US-based peoples, has nothing to do with Latin America, and that in Latin America, we never knew anything about racism. We're all just a racially mixed utopia, and anything that we may say or do that others might sort of view as problematic, no, that's a cultural misunderstanding because you're the racist, not us.
Right. In your book, you distinguish between colorism, race, ethnicity. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably. Could you give us the distinction between those terms and how they're used in this context?
Well, of course, colorism overlaps a great deal with racism. They're part of the same problematic dynamic in society of viewing others as less than because of their appearance. But the reason why I like to talk about colorism as sometimes too comfortable a space for conversation, and people acknowledge colorism and then they leave it there and they don't want to talk about racism, is because colorism is about your phenotype, right? You know, how you appear to others in skin shape. People sort of get very stuck on skin shape.
Right.
But when people are discriminated against based solely on knowledge of their ancestry, not their appearance, they may look sort of innocuous to others, but they find out that there's some African ancestry up there in the mix, and then they experience discrimination when others find out about that. That's not about your color. That's not about colorism. That is about racism, right? It's about the ways in which your racial ancestry is viewed as unwelcome.
Right.
And then the reason why I like to also sort of take apart issues about ethnicity is that even though people can experience discrimination based on their national origin, where their families have come from, the way in which within ethnicity there's also racism can be overlooked if we talk about race and ethnicity as all one and the same. So in my case example of Latinos, Latinx, these are peoples in which we have those who are of African ancestry, Asian ancestry, European ancestry, and not always just a happy mix, like meaning unambiguously Black people, right, are part of the Latin American and Latino complex here in the US. And so not all Latinos experience discrimination the same way, because not all of us are positioned to be white appearing or have white identities, etc. And so sort of understanding that race can operate on its own vectors, distinct from ethnicity, is important to keep track of. One guy can't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Sorry. You talk a lot about, you use the term Latino whiteness. And you talk about, the features of lighter skinned Latinos versus darker skinned Latinos and the tensions within the community. Could you speak to that? And you also talked about how different countries are viewed as, countries where darker skinned Latinos are from or originate versus white Latinos come from other countries. How does that inform us in this context?
Well, part of this racially innocent landscape that I describe in the book is talking about race without acknowledging we're talking about race,
Right.
and acting out racial distinctions. And one of the ways that we do that is by looking at countries as proxies for talking about race. So to say that, oh, I so love when people who come from Argentina, they're just so good looking, they just have such good culture, etc. I don't really like, I don't think it's aesthetically as pleasing to people who come from Colombia, or who come from Brazil. Right? Those are spaces in which, in Latin America, our language and grammar for sort of talking about things in the shadows, those are proxies for, those are where the Black people are. Right? Whereas Argentina is viewed as, obviously broad stereotypes, but that we have Black and white people everywhere, but we view as Argentina as being the white space. And so when in a U.S. workplace, for instance, right, that's right, cover anti-discrimination law in its various phases. When in a U.S. workplace, we've got a predominantly Latino workforce, and distinctions are being made about who should be subject to discipline for some, ill in the workplace. And the Argentinians are the ones who come out unscathed. And the Colombians and the Brazilians are the ones who are sort of dismissed, right, or docked wages or what have you. Right? That is about a racially informed discipline, as opposed to one that is just, it may be, there's different cultural backgrounds, but it's not the same, as equating it to issues of racism in the United States. Yes, it is.
Right. In chapter 3 of your book, I'm glad you brought up employment, because you talk a lot about that in chapter 3. I was captured by the stories you told, particularly the one about the teacher at Medgar Evers, and I just wanted to kind of drill down on. You discuss racial innocence in the context of judicial decision making in civil rights cases, and again around employment discrimination in particular. How does this perception or claim of racial innocence manifest itself in these cases where you have anti-Black racial discrimination engaged by other Latinos, and how the judges respond to that?
Well, part of the problem is if the judges haven't been provided with a backdrop for understanding these dynamics, then it's much too easy for them to be susceptible to these Latino claims of, this isn't possible for me to have, been accused of discrimination because in my family, I have, all these people who are racially mixed, you look at me and you think I'm white, but I'm not white, but, I come from all of this richness and what have you. Now, that might be factually true or not, but it's immaterial. That's like them trying to mount a pseudo defense to racism. Your racial identity is immaterial, right, to whether or not your actions are discriminatory. But when it comes to the Latino perpetrator, for lack of a better way, some judges, unfortunately, I think in part because they have not been made racially literate about how Latino discrimination operates, they view it as something sort of anomalous and unrelated to what they think is the Black-white binary in the United States, as opposed to having some detail about the ways in which this is the Black binary itself.
Right. In chapter 3, you also note that there's no federal judge in the federal district court system in Puerto Rico that identifies as Afro-Puerto Rican. And you discuss those implications. Could you kind of share what that really means and the impact of that, particularly in that context of Puerto Rico?
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason why I included Puerto Rico in the book itself is because I thought it would be a very helpful space so to detail how much this is part of our culture and not the idea of, you come to the United States and you take on new U.S. cultural mores, and unfortunately, we become tainted by U.S. racism as well as Latinos, right? And in Puerto Rico, that's a space in which Puerto Rico law applies at the local level, and then the feds, employ Title VII at the federal level. But all the judges are of Puerto Rican descent. And so watching the ways in which those judges in Puerto Rico are just as sort of prone to dismissing instances of racial discrimination because they're drinking the same Kool-Aid, right? They also believe, right, that they as white elites, this is what they are there as, part of what is the sort of the normal meritocratic ascendancy, as opposed to sort of really drilling down into the ways in which there's a racial hierarchy of access to quality education in Puerto Rico itself. Right? Everything that we understand about the U.S. is also part of the Latin American, Caribbean dynamic as well. And so to show that these Latino judges can do just as much harm for lack of racial literacy, I thought was important to illustrate.
So what can be done to help lawyers and judges become more educated in this space around the intra-ethnic racial discrimination issues that we often dismiss as, oh, it can't be about race because everybody in the involved was a member of a particular racial class that was not white.
Well, what I thought was sort of an exciting part of this project for the book on racial innocence was that I not only delved into all these cases to see what the patterns were of racial exclusion as committed by Latinos, but also interviewed various stakeholders. So I talked to employment discrimination lawyers, I talked to civil rights activists, I talked to school teachers for the education chapter and principals. And what I came away with, in particular in the litigation space, was that cases that were successful in helping the judge understand what was before them were cases in which the plaintiff attorneys took on the extra work of giving that rich tapestry of understanding. So meaning bringing in the expert witnesses. This is costly, I can see, right? But because we're sort of at the beginnings of trying to create racial literacy, it's going to take resources. And, over time, well, then this will become almost sort of like judicial notice. But in the meantime, it's going to be sort of more of a heavy lift on the part of, the litigators. And then as part of our DEI work, it should be much more multicultural in showing the ways in which we're all part of this. Certainly the implicit bias education is helpful in this, but that too gets sort of steeped in this idea of, oh, this is only a US problem, as a part of the idea that it's a global phenomena. And so those who are viewing themselves as not part of the US framework don't get a pass because it's a global phenomena. All of us need to be held accountable.
So how would you respond to those who say that the race or perspective of the judge is not important because all judges should view cases with a neutral, objective lens? How do you respond to that critique?
I mean, I think objectivity is a wonderful thing, but the problem is if you have objectivity that is accompanied by a lack, an ignorance, well, that's not very helpful in adjudicating and resolving claims of injustice. Right? But by that, I simply mean that a judge that wants to be neutral, but at the same time, because of their lack of literacy about global racism, is not readily understanding the actions of racial exclusion and bias that are committed by Latinos, for instance, and view it as almost like a pseudo defense. It doesn't exist within the law, but nevertheless, they are more prone to accepting that as a justification for these various forms of racial exclusion. Then that's not neutrality that is a pursuit of justice. That's a neutrality that has blinders on because of ignorance. And so, I mean, I wouldn't call becoming educated and more fully informed a lack of neutrality, but it's certainly about having a wider panorama for being able to adjudicate the claims that come before you.
Because often this is used to argue that we don't need more diversity on the bench because judges aren't supposed to bring any biases to their judicial decision making, which I think you and I both know is not the case.
Well, I mean,
Right.
judges can't leave behind who they are. All of us
Right.
bring who we are to any endeavor. And so to ask that they have superpowers, I think is somewhat unfair.
Right. Right. And you highlight the fact that I think you mentioned 15% of some of these employment cases are in favor of the plaintiff, compared to over 50% of other civil matters. And so
Yes.
you show those disparities.
Yes, it's a very difficult challenge
Right.
that plaintiffs have in bringing forth their claims, and particularly in this context in which there's sort of a lack of judicial understanding of the
Right.
intricacies and nuances of the claims.
Right. So what would you suggest needs to be done in the context of education, formal and informal, around teaching not only students, young students, but even re-educating or being what I've learned is lifelong learners, to kind of break down some of these stereotypes, these myths around ethnic racial discrimination. As I mentioned to you before we formally started, I have seen this in my own community in the Chicagoland area, the tensions between Black and brown communities, but also within the context of the brown communities, Latino communities, the tensions there between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Cubans. This is real, and I think a lot of us see this. So what can we do as lawyers, but also just as responsible citizens, to unmask and really take off the blinders and grow in these spaces?
Well, we certainly enable ourselves to be agents of positive change and contribute in small ways when we have a better understanding, right, of the
Right.
way in which global anti-Blackness operates. So, just one small factoid I would put out there. Often people feel disempowered calling out Latino anti-Blackness because they feel, well, if they're not Latino in particular, well, this is not my culture, maybe
Right.
I'm not getting it properly. And if they were armed with the knowledge, like for instance, that Latin America was the site, Latin America and the Caribbean together were the sites of 90% of the transatlantic African slave trade.
Right.
90%. Only 3.5%, forcibly brought to what we now call the United States and North America.
Right.
So if you have this, just even the beginnings of this data, then you're much readily able to say, well, certainly the legacy of slavery and all its justification schemes that we understand to be the racial sort of knowledge base of racism, that does not dissipate overnight, certainly when it's never been readily interrogated or intervened into, right? So
Right.
having the beginning of having the knowledge is the way to be able to then be able to actually be useful in intervening.
Right. So in terms of education, as a law professor, there's been a lot of discussion in the last several months, last few years around critical race theory. It's been politicized and used as a weapon to divide many aspects of our country. I've seen instances where people have been asked, what is critical race theory? They don't know, but they're just against it. As a law professor, could you help our listening audience understand what is critical race theory and what is not critical race theory?
There has been a massive onslaught of using critical race theory just as a sort of useful catchphrase to encapsulate everything that is about having a racial reckoning in the wake of
Right.
George Floyd's murder. And so DEI is anything DEI, implicit bias, children learning the 1619 Project,
Black History Month.
Black History Month, all of this, right? It's
Right.
swept up in this idea that it's critical race theory. In actuality, critical race theory is a jurisprudence and sort of framework for understanding how racism operates systemically. Right? It's not the finger pointing, looking for individuals who are racist and calling them out and, you know, flogging them on the streets, which it gets portrayed as.
Right.
Rather, you know, critical race theory is a very useful form of educating law students into a language and a grammar, right, of being able to readily analyze and then articulate claims of discrimination, have an understanding for the patterns that exist. You know, why is it after we dismantle white-only signs across our nation that you could still have the ongoing racial disparities in the world, right? Other than a facile attribution, oh, well, it must be because all these people have bad culture and bad biology, right? Is when you sweep that off as the racist nonsense that those explanations are, what you're left with is looking at the ways in which systems and structures themselves imbue all kinds of barriers that create the racial disparities. And so critical race theory is about being able to deconstruct how that operates and then use law for positive change.
And so this is being taught in selective law schools, not in third grade, right?
No, I'm sorry, I should have started with no. Critical race theory emanates in the from law schools, lawyers, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when they started to see the dismantling of civil rights laws with the Reagan era and what have you, and there was a disenchantment with this belief that if we took down the white-only signs, if we addressed racial inequality as a matter of formal inequality, that will resolve everything. Critical race theory steps in to address that moment. And so it's by lawyers for lawyers. It has since traveled. And so that in graduate schools of education, it is very well utilized as, again, a framework for doing their own analysis within the educational context. But K through 12 teachers, they barely know what the 1619 project is, let alone having the nuances to teach a lawyer's arsenal of tools that we call critical race theory.
Right. And they've never heard of names like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Tanya Hernández, I'm sure. And that's not criticizing teachers, but that's not their lane. And so that needs to be said over and over again to kind of diffuse this notion that third graders are being taught critical race theory, and Black history and Latino history is not critical race theory. It's history.
Although I would add one, you know, that being said, I am of the belief, it sounds like heresy, I imagine, that it would be useful if critical race theory were taught in K through 12. Meaning there's a way in which these insights, especially for children who are living in the world of the racial disparities, readily gravitate to having a way to explain their exclusion as something other than their own moral failings. Right? So critical race theory would be a fantastic thing to bring to K through 12, but factually speaking, it is not there.
Wow. What I hear there is an opportunity to do some curriculum building and some reimagining around what we should be teaching our youth around the world and the country.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us where we can find your book, Racial Innocence, and just kind of let you kind of end with any parting words, but also just tell us where we can read your book and find your book and any other work you'd like to reference for us.
Well, I'm very happy that my publisher, Beacon Press, has made the book Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias available both in ebook, so it's digital, it's in cloth, and it's also in audio. You can find it on Amazon. And if you're an indie book enthusiast, you can get it on bookshop.org, and they'll connect you immediately to your local indie bookstore. So it's pretty much available in most places that sell books.
Wonderful. Well, Professor Hernández, I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate your contribution to this important conversation. And we'll be definitely working with you and others in the future to continue to promote civil rights, social justice, and a broadening of our understanding of the complexities of discrimination and racial issues in our country and globally. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening.